I'm so delighted to have a very easy job today, which basically was to convene a symposium, what I call of emerging research in two-way immersion programs. And I'm so delighted to have the panelists that are here today. I'm not going to do an extensive introduction for each one of them. I'll let them add whatever details they might want to add about themselves as researchers. But I want to highlight Rebecca Starr, which is on our, coming through us through, I guess, Google+. Can I say the reason why you're not here in person? You want to say that?
Okay.
Oh, there's a good reason. Maybe not. So that was Rebecca Starr. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. Then on this side, we have Hernandez and Erika Feinauer and Sharon Merritt, who will each be talking about different issues related to two-way immersion. And what I try to do, what my goal was with the symposium, is to highlight issues that have been under-researched in two-way immersion. So there are plenty of really good people out there that are doing comparisons of models and their effectiveness, and I said it's okay not to maybe focus on that. So what you see today in the presentations are interesting issues of language ideologies, issues around identities and cultural identities, and issues around instructional practices that really support the mission of two-way immersion programs. Unfortunately, Zitlali Morales is not with us today. I'm sorry that she cannot make it. Her work on identity is very, very interesting as well. It does give each of the presenters about 20 minutes for the presentation. And what I'd like to do, just in terms of organization, I'm always worried that if we allow for a lot of question answer in between speakers, that the last speaker just does not have the time that they also deserve. So what I'd like to do is to just have the presenters present. And then whatever questions that you have, just write them down and hold them for the very end. We will have plenty of time for discussion for each of the presenters. We're going to go in the order as they are listed in the program. So I'm going to ask, where's our tech part guy? Dan is going to do all the technology parts. I'm going to ask Erika to kick us off. Thank you.
Okay, just a second here. This is you, right?
That's me.
Okay.
Awesome. I love technology. Well, love and hate technology. It's a pleasure to be here today. I thank you so much, Esther, for inviting me to be with these lovely women on this panel. This is just a great treat for me. And today I'm going to be talking about some work we've been doing in one two-way immersion program in Utah, in Salt Lake City. I'm a professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Brigham Young University, and teach a lot of the literacy classes. That's kind of my thing, and I do research in two-way immersion. Obviously, that's why I'm here. But I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, my colleagues in this work. My colleagues, Dr. Kendra Hall-Kenyon and Kimberly Davison, and of course the awesome students at the Dual Immersion Academy. They're lovely. So the work that we've been doing, spending some time looking at, is really in response to a call to investigate the differential roles that first and second oral language play in second language literacy outcomes. And this is a two-way immersion context is really a great place to look at that, right? Since students are receiving instruction both in the literacy in both languages and also many times explicit oral language support. And really we were thinking around two constructs or two theories that have informed so much work already. They're not new theories, but there's still so much to learn and understand about the complex relationships between oral language and literacy. And I think it's important work to do theoretically. It's really important work to do empirically. And I think if we continue to do good work in this area, it has direct implications for practice. So really we have looked over a couple of years at more carefully at trying to gather empirical evidence for the linguistic interdependence hypothesis, the idea that, and these again aren't new, I've been in the field for a very long time, but the reading performance in a second language is shared or impacted and draws from reading ability in the first language. And then the linguistic threshold hypothesis says that in order to read in a second language, that a level of second language linguistic ability must first be achieved. Again, these are not new, and they've been drawn on theoretically, but there isn't a ton of empirical evidence. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's see. I also wanted to just say that a lot of people have talked about, for example, Alderson has framed this as sort of, is second language reading a language problem or a reading problem? And of course, the word problem is problematic, but it really speaks to the issue of whether literacy in the second language is, what are these complex processes? Is it the literacy skills in the first language, or how does oral language impact those relationships? So what the empirical work for transfer is, there's more empirical work for transfer in the field than there is for the threshold hypothesis. And so several studies have demonstrated that some of the more constrained aspects of literacy, such as phonological awareness and letter knowledge, transfer from L1 to L2. And a lot of work by Mellon Bialystock, for example, talks about how this is mediated, of course, by the languages that one is transferring from and to. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. But fewer studies have really have demonstrated the transfer of unconstrained skills in more systematic ways. And our thinking about adding to this work was really guided by Scott Paris's work on constrained and unconstrained skills, and thinking about his call to look at the different growth trajectories in component skills of literacy. And that had us thinking about how that might impact the way we understand transfer, and might be another added dimension that would be interesting to look at. Now for the threshold hypothesis, research has found stronger relationships for L1 and L2 reading skills for students at higher levels of L2 reading. For example, Lee and Challert did a great study in Korean, among Korean students, looking at their transfer into English at different levels of proficiency. And a lot of studies have found that the threshold, the linguistic threshold, varies according to such things as readers' motivation or background knowledge. But in general, there's just less empirical support for the threshold hypothesis. So I'm going to present some of the work that we're trying to do to really provide some empirical support for the threshold hypothesis. So our whole research project was guided by two research questions, a transfer question and then this threshold question. To what extent does L1 reading ability contribute to L2 reading ability? And we're looking at very young Spanish-English bilinguals, and we're looking at them across component skills, thinking about them in constrained and unconstrained, the constrained sort of definition as put forth by Scott Paris. And also, how might L2 oral language proficiency mediate that relationship for very young Spanish-English bilinguals? Again, this is also interesting because of the age of the students in the program. We're looking at kindergartner and first graders, so talk more about that. So here's the site, the place where we're doing this research. So the Dual Immersion Academy is a K-6 charter school in Salt Lake City. It's 50-50 two-way immersion, and they're committed to, during the years that we were in the school, they opened in fall of 2007, they were really committed to this idea that all literacy in the early grades be provided in the first language or the dominant language, and that oral language support be provided in the second language in explicit and systematic ways. Let's see. There are 174 students in our sample, kindergartners and first graders, and it's interesting to call them Spanish dominant versus English dominant. That's just how we separated them out. But the decisions about a language of instruction were largely determined by parent reports of home language dominance in the home when they were enrolled in the school, as well as parent choice when there was equal use in the home. So which was more relevant for the Latino students in our sample, of course. We collected data from the Woodcock-Johnson battery and the Woodcock-Munoz, the parallel in Spanish. And we collected data at 2 points, in the fall and in the spring, so we're looking at this over time. And sound awareness, letter word ID, and word attack are considered our constrained skills. Reading fluency, passage comprehension, and reading vocabulary were unconstrained. Now, I want to just say a caveat, I suppose, that this idea of constrained and unconstrained skills, Scott Pears talks more about the unconstrained are more meaning-based, the constrained are perhaps more skill-based, right, with shorter growth trajectories and things like that. And reading fluency is sort of an in-betweener, is the way I think about it. I think about these things more on a continuum. It's certainly more constrained than vocabulary, but it's less constrained than, say, phonemic awareness, right? So that's how I'm understanding that. And our measure of oral language was the picture vocabulary from the Woodcock-Johnson, which is a productive vocabulary measure. And this is where I want to apologize, because there's going to be some numbers coming up, but I'll do my best to make them interesting and compelling. So these are just the distributions of their oral language at spring, so after a full year of instruction. And this is interesting because you see that the Spanish instruction group has higher proficiency in their second language, in English, than the English dominant students do in their second language, which is Spanish. And this is after a full year of instruction, so I just wanted to point out, I didn't come up with another slide, but this pattern was even more pronounced at the beginning of the year. So the students, the Spanish students, the Spanish dominant students, were not really Spanish dominant, right? They were more bilingual, and the English students were more monolingual. And that's sort of the linguistic profile. I'm going to summarize quickly what we found in the transfer, for the transfer question, and then move to the threshold. So our question is, to what extent does L1 reading skills transfer to L2 reading skills over a year? We just did a multiple regression model, and we found that we found transfer. Yay! Love it when a plan comes together, right? And then we divided the students into language dominant groups and then we had a bilingual group. So we had bilingual instructed in Spanish and bilingual instructed in English. And the bilingual group taught in English. There were only 7 of them, so we couldn't run analyses. But the English dominant group had clear, they're a much more homogeneous group, and they had some clear effects for transfer. And the Spanish students that were more dominant in Spanish, their transfer effects were sort of tricky to interpret, especially looking across we looked at them across the different component skills. But, and especially for, I was going to say, there was no clear pattern for the constrained or the unconstrained skills, where for the English dominant students, there was a clear transfer effect, especially for the constrained skills, which makes sense considering their level of literacy was beginning, right? Okay, so this started us thinking about why, which is good, that studies sort of provoke thinking. And we wanted to explain this, and we realized that, the Spanish dominant students in our study, they had all very different oral language proficiency trajectories, and perhaps it's just not sufficient to group them into these language dominant groups to control for oral language, right? But to look at transfer as a function of their oral language proficiency, and then realize that we were really asking a type of linguistic threshold hypothesis or question. So that led us to this study, to these questions. Again, more numbers coming up. Brace yourself. We have this question: how might L2 oral language proficiency mediate the relationship between first language and second language reading abilities for very young Spanish-English bilinguals across component skills? Specifically, the threshold hypothesis suggests that cross-language transfer is not constant across oral language, but perhaps a nonlinear function of some kind. It's a threshold, right? Thus, linear models have limitations when it comes to specifying statistical models that might best describe linguistic thresholds for transfer. So in this study, we are seeking to understand if there is a threshold effect for L2 oral language in this transfer process, and to explore new ways of understanding and modeling a potential nonlinear relationship. Given the purpose, we had 2 hypotheses. One is a linear function, and one is we hypothesize that the transfer is a linear function of L2 oral language ability, and then we have an alternate hypothesis that transfer is significantly higher when students cross a specified threshold of L2 oral language ability. Now we chose, I like pictures, those help. We're using a change point regression model as a nonlinear model, and there are many ways to model this threshold, but I'll explain what this is in a minute. But it's a very simplistic way to model a nonlinear relationship. This is the linear interaction model, as you'd expect, just a linear function. This is what it looks like, and this is what our regression equation was. And what we found when we ran those analyses was that for the English group, again, more straightforward. We found that. Sorry, I keep hitting that. So for the Spanish group, 2 of the 6 components, there was transfer. That there was this threshold, this linear relationship. And for the English group, there was a linear relationship. In other words, the interaction effect was significant for 5 out of the 6. So we did find that there was a threshold, a linear, that the transfer from the first language to the second language was a linear function of their oral language ability. So that is interesting. When we looked at it, however, with the change point regression model, this is what the change point regression model looks like. So a simple approach to estimating a change point or a threshold, it's an adaptation of a profile likelihood method. This is assuming that a linguistic threshold would fall at approximately the same value for individuals within the same language group. So we added a spline term, so a term that can be varied at different values of oral language. So this allows us to shift the value of oral language and then refit models, looking at which model fits best. And that's how we're looking for the threshold. So we used this change point regression procedure to look specifically for threshold effects within each literacy component in question. Because we anticipated that any threshold found would vary by literacy skill as well by student language characteristic, we needed an approach that would allow us to do this. And the change point regression allows for this modeling of the relationship in between L1, 2, and L2 literacy above and below specific levels of L2 oral language. Again, picture vocabulary was used in the model as a predictor variable. The value of this potential oral language proficiency, so the oral language proficiency value was iteratively increased, and the model was re-estimated until the threshold value was found, which was when the statistics showed optimum model fit. And this was, we used the maximum likelihood estimation, which produces the AIC statistic, which allows for comparison between non-nested models. And we also looked at the p-value. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. As an example of how we did this is one example. This is reading fluency for English for the English group. This presents an illustrative example of the change point regression. Here, an optimal threshold for this sample was found at a Spanish picture vocabulary test of 11, right? So each model was fit. And at 11, you can see that the AIC reaches a minimum of 394.17, and the threshold effect is significant and large. And the threshold effect of 0.33, which is the threshold effect over there, suggests that students at or above that threshold can be expected to have on average a 0.33 point increase in Spanish reading fluency for every 1 point increase in English reading fluency. So that specifies the relationship of transfer when you cross that threshold of 11 in second language oral language proficiency. So this is just an example. We did this iterative process across all components for both groups. And all components except for sound awareness, which is an interesting case, evidence for this type of threshold was found. We found that in each case, there was a minimized AIC for students, and there were a significance on the threshold effect. So these findings suggest support for the threshold hypothesis having a more nonlinear relationship. It's interesting to note. Well, let me just show you then what we did, because part of the point of comparing both of these approaches to finding a threshold was to compare them, right? So this is a model. This is a table that compares the numbers, the AIC statistics from the linear models that we fit, along with the change point regression. And in each case, except for sound awareness, which is has a different, very constrained skill, the AIC statistics were lower by over 3 points in most cases, and an AIC statistic is considered to be to denote a better fitting model from 3 to 7. and above 10, it's very unlikely that the other model would fit better, like highly, highly unlikely. So in nearly all cases, the AIC was lower at the identified threshold in the change point regression models than in comparable models estimated under the linear interaction hypotheses. And this suggests that the linear interaction model, though providing evidence of cross-linguistic transfer, is not the best fitting approach for identifying threshold effects related to this transfer. And I don't have time to go through this, and you're probably grateful. But going to the findings and implications, we can find empirical evidence for the threshold hypothesis, and I think it's important that we seek to do so. The oral language proficiency plays a role in literacy, in our literacy outcomes in the second language, but as would be suggested by the theory, the linear interaction model may not be the best fitting model. There were differences when we do look more closely at the numbers. There were differences across the language groups. So things come to mind like perhaps there is more than one threshold, right? These are things that we can look for if we're using this iterative change point regression model. Also, there may be better fitting nonlinear models, maybe asymptotic for some skills, or I'm not even sure what that second one would be called, but also some sort of change, different slopes at different levels of oral language, and that might be something that we can look more closely at. So anyway, I just think I would just encourage us as a field to continue to look more carefully. The reason that this two-way immersion program was such a great place to look at that is because there was explicit instruction in the first language and oral language support in the second language, which gives us a really good chance to look at early growth trajectories in literacy and oral language. And we should consider carefully the growth patterns and trajectories of different languages and the different, across the different component skills given their growth trajectories. So I think that's everything. I think my time is up, basically. Thank you very much. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Hernandez, and I'm from California State University, San Marcos. And just to give you a little background about my positionality with this research that I did, basically this is part of my dissertation, and it assesses and challenges of instructional practices in two-way immersion. I'm a 32-year veteran teacher, just retired, and 20 years of that journey has been in two-way immersion programs. And so I really wanted to become a professor to actually investigate things that I had questions for when I was a teacher. So this is a different kind of study using a different methodology. I use a lot of photography in this methodology. I had the teachers do photo journals, which they brought to interviews. So it's really about their narratives. It's really to hear their voices in the field to inform our practices. So I invite you to join me in looking at our study, my study. I began with what was the rationale and what I started to see the gaps in the research in terms of teacher behaviors and teacher instructional practices, and this need to identify what we're doing in our dual immersion classes, a need to look at instruction in meaningful ways, and seeing what strategies are teachers implementing in the field that went along with these gaps that we're seeing in our research. So not that I filled all these gaps in my research, but it was an opportunity for us to really investigate as teachers what we're doing in our practices. I looked at the review of the literature. I was very interested in teacher efficacy in two-way bilingual immersion programs. And looking at the literature, I found that teachers felt very compelled to their work and pushed themselves forward when their preparation programs provided a continuity between their beliefs and their practices. Another study by Catherine Lindholm-Leary said that teachers felt very supported when there was that support level at the principal level and with their parents. not really in what program they were in, whether it was a 50-50 or 90-10, but it was really the level of support that they were gaining. Another review that I did was on teachers being part of a teacher learning community or PLCs, where they're really examining their practices, they're reflecting on what they're doing every day, and that provides readjustments to their curriculum in a very introspective way, and to look forward to what learning can look like tomorrow. So basing on what they taught today, they're going to look at their students tomorrow, rather than flipping pages in a manual. Another way is that teachers plan curriculum together. That makes them more powerful, more productive in their work when they collaborate with colleagues. Another study demonstrated that when teachers have a personal stake in their students and their program, they really want to revitalize their community. They feel part of who they are and their children. There's more connectedness there. And the last piece of literature that I looked at that I thought was relevant here was that they become advocates for very marginalized types of students that no one else in their schools are advocating for. So there was this passion there to talk about their students and promote what they were doing. My research questions were around the guiding principles of dual education. And this was really the tool that I used with the teachers and the tool that I used through my observations. So we were all looking, all kind of triangulated through the same way. So the questions were one of reflection and practice on how are the guiding principles for dual language assisting teachers in implementing their instructional strategies, whether you're even aware this document is out there to guide our practices. The other one was really on their teacher efficacy. Based on their successes and challenges, how are they looking at instructions to move forward in terms of innovations and perspectives in their practices? So I took a framework that's a seminal piece of work in educational leadership that talks about teacher leadership and looking at teacher behavior, their personal factors, and their investments that they're bringing into their work, to look at their environments and places where they work, to see how their behavior is in terms of their communities and their school systems. And the social learning theory talks a lot about a mastering of experiences through this entire triangle here, where teachers feel part of a community, they're validated by their personal beliefs, and that interacts with their behavior. Looking at others being successful who are around them and being able to feel comfortable to ask the right questions to their peers, and having a feeling of verbal encouragement from their principals, from their parents, from their community, validates their work on a day-to-day basis. And this whole issue really transposes to their psychological responses and their emotional state, whether they're happy in their jobs or not. So I looked at the participants in nine teachers in the Los Angeles area and the San Diego County area, two major districts in our counties, 90-10 programs in two elementary schools. One was a K-5, the other one was a K-8. Both of them met criteria through the Center for Applied Linguistics, and they had met their AYP and API, which is very important now these days in accountability. Looking at demographics, these teachers were very trustworthy, and they had a background that was amazing, that I thought whatever they're saying, it seems like they understand their field, they know where they're coming from, because they had mastery of over 17 years average. And look at this, 19 years. So many years in education, and majority of those years in two-way bilingual immersion programs. They were native speakers, they had bilingual certification, and also they had advanced degrees. So they knew a lot about teaching. This is their knowledge base, based on a questionnaire that I used with them. They seem very knowledgeable in the areas that you see that are red, in all the things that are pertinent to our dual language immersion in terms of theoretical frameworks, as well as differentiating instruction, using thematic teaching, cooperative learning, all these areas that we advocate. And then they seem somewhat knowledgeable too in these areas. But what was interesting to me in finding out is that 70 to 100% of the time they were implementing this, because I also went in and observed their teaching. So using the guiding principles for dual language as a tool, I brought in a lot of measures, so this was quite a big case study for myself. From this document, I pulled the questionnaires for the teacher, the lesson observation instrument. We did photo elicitation journals that they brought for the interviews. I did an appreciative inquiry-based interview for focus interviews, which is Prescott and Katsamba's work in building on strengths of teachers and having them visualize a vision for their program. And then we used teacher reflection forms. So it was a lot of data that I collected in order to triangulate it all and make sense of it. This was the most challenging part, is just coordinating all of it to actually come up with the results. So here's where I want to spend the time here, is looking at the guiding principles for dual language, how they felt about them, how the teachers rated themselves, and also explain to you some of their voices. Along with that is things were congruent for what they said and what I observed, which was very interesting. So for the first guiding principle, which is really on research-based practices, both schools that I worked with, they rated themselves full to exemplary implementation, and some of the documentation that they had in the photo journals and in their interview had this notion of strong separation of languages, a lot of explicit instruction, differentiating learning on a day-to-day basis by flexibility of grouping and meeting the needs of the students, and really providing very meaningful lessons. For the guiding principle number 2, which was really the core of it, instructional practices, both schools felt they were full to exemplary implementation within their classrooms, but then they rated partial to minimal implementations the support staff and the specials, like special education services. A lot of the teachers there were not bilingual, so these services were being provided only in English. If they went to art or music or PE, this was only provided in English. So they felt their schools were really not meeting this instructional strategies for both languages. And so one of the things that I noticed and they really talked about was developing language and content objectives in their lessons. A lot of front-loading of vocabulary, sometimes taking up to 2 days before they actually went into the core lessons because they really needed to prepare the students for success. And this whole team teaching approach was across their grade levels. They did vertical as well as horizontal approaches to teaching and integrating their curriculum and using a lot of hands-on activities that were meaningful for the students. In the guiding principle 3, where is student-centered information, and instruction, both schools fell full to exemplary implementation in this. And they were actively involving students in cooperative learning, learning centers, building prior knowledge, scaffolding wherever they could for both languages, making sure the students were metacognitively and cognitively engaged in thinking, in higher order thinking skills, and a lot of literature circles rather than the textbooks, because the literature was able to bring in some of the cultural pieces and some of the ways of living within their communities. For guiding principle 4, we hit a wall. And this was multilingual, multicultural learning, and they were all over the place. They were from the range from minimal all the way to exemplary, and the same thing happened to me in my observations. They were very challenged by balancing this academic and cultural goals of the program. They didn't know where to fit in the third goal. We're looking for a program. How can you help us with that? We don't know what to do with it. They had never been trained on it. Their schools had never conversed about it. And so it was this notion that it was this sister in the closet, the appendage, the thing that they didn't know anything to do with. Little time, they kept complaining, we just don't have time to address cross-cultural competence. Everything is so demanding in terms of instruction and our push to English that we don't have any time to include this cultural piece in here. The focus was on English and English testing in their benchmarks, in their standardized testing, in everything that they were asked for. They felt their hands were tied in these areas. Materials lack resources that address the real true issues and real true needs for our students in dual language immersion. And one of the things they really talked about was this dominance of English proficient students during peer interaction. And they really felt our ELs were being silenced by allowing the EOs to utilize English during our Spanish language time. And so there was a real issue here of equity and social justice in our small group interactions with our students, particularly in the upper grades, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. The K through 3rd teachers did not see this, but it was very apparent as they hit 4th grade. Here's some of their voices here. And the first one is, you know, this notion that I don't have time. It has to be at the end of the year after we're done with testing. So I highlighted it in red for you. The other one had to be with the need of this cultural appreciation that they knew they weren't addressing and knew that it was so critical to our program that they needed to include cultural standards. And the other one was about the status of Spanish that was tremendously suffering by allowing students still in 4th and 5th and 6th grade to discuss in small group instruction in English during their Spanish language time. They felt that was really detrimental to the status of Spanish. The question, too, is about innovations and how were these teachers really being innovative in terms of their craft. And cross-cultural was the first one. They kept looking at different things to adapt their curriculum and look at community and seek resources. The balancing of languages, they kept trying to elevate the status of ELs. They were trying to infuse a lot more grammar and structures to maybe support the language for the EO students who really couldn't converse and keep the conversation in the target language. And they wanted to create protocols for group interaction. Just throwing them together in cooperative learning and telling them their roles was just not enough. The kids really needed protocols and opportunities to scaffold their learning, to be able to continue. It had to be something that kids needed to solve themselves in terms to be able to continue communicating. And they felt really guilty, very guilty about their leniency to allow code switching in dual language programs. They felt that we need to reach a certain level in grade levels where we can say, from now on, you're very accountable to both languages, and you need to really think before you speak. So they didn't want to jeopardize that. Curriculum decisions were difficult as well. They were trying to infuse a lot more technology and getting connected internationally with other programs. And in collaborating with colleagues, they felt they could be dividing tasks among each other to reflecting more on their practices. Here are some of their voices for scaffolding students for language status. They wanted to make sure the students knew what the language of each discipline sounded like in the context of, say, compare and contrast and some of these other higher learning areas. They were trying to elevate the EL student by having the EL student do be more modeling, be more in leadership roles, be more recognized as leaders and demonstrating it in the classroom. And reflection of practices, they always felt they needed to be reinventing the wheel. If not, they were going to become stagnant and not grow. Oh, good. I can slow down. I got 10 minutes. Forgive me. I'm trying to race through this. Woo, we can slow down. So, okay. So going back to our theoretical framework for teacher leadership and this notion of efficacy, what I found out is really support system was what was key for these teachers. They felt a sense of accomplishment and a real true passion for their work and what they were doing that really motivated and escalated their work to really high quality. I must tell you, those classrooms were just a joy to go in and really see the beautiful things that they were doing. And the relationships they have built among themselves for support systems and the relationships they have built in their communities. So one of the things I found is what held them together was this notion of community of practice, which Wenger and McDermott and Snyder really talk about in terms of educational leadership. How they collaborate on a passionate topic from day to day was something that I noticed them doing at lunchtime, before school, after school, going to each other's houses, dividing up tasks. This was really a community of practice I had never before observed in my 32 years of teaching in teachers wanting their programs to work so badly. They were attending conferences. There were teachers that were current in their field. They knew the latest research, and they knew how to implement things that were research-based. In terms of school system, they felt very, very supported by their strong administrative support and parental and family support. Their own family, they felt, was really supportive of their work, of coming home late, of being there on weekends, on staying after school, to provide differentiated instruction and, for the students. But they felt the district really didn't know what they were doing. And these were established programs in these districts that had been there for over 15, almost 20 years. District policy always was against the grain of the dual language program. This policy of all benchmarks needed to be in English and took no consideration to their primary language or their target language instruction. So they really felt that their district administrators really needed to be a little bit more sympathetic with them and to really understand the goals of the program before they implement these policies that are just blankets policies across the districts, but making no exceptions to their programs. Here's a teacher quote that I really like where they said, "We talk all the time. We sit and discuss, hey, how did this go? What did you do here? Oh, I'm going to go do that too." You have to have that level of collaboration, is what teachers said. If you don't, it can be get very difficult. We cannot do this work alone, is what they kept telling me over and over again. So for instructional implications, here's a few things to think about. To really elevate the status of Spanish language and culture in our classrooms, we really need to examine the shifts that silence our EL students in our classroom. These are students who are marginalized, and particularly for California, these students were the landowners back in the 1800s, and now they're the servants in those same lands these days. In some of our communities, they're sitting side by side with students that are EO, that are owners of groves in California, and the child sitting next to them, their parents are the pickers. And even the students sometimes work in these fields. And so we need to really think about why are we taking away a language that's already marginalized for students that are being ignored in many communities. The other thing to think about in terms of putting kids together for cooperative learning is to facilitate group interactions with protocols. So it isn't like, oh, I don't know how to say that word in Spanish, so I'm going to switch to English. And the ELs feel the power of English and the power of these EO students, and they give up their primary language just because they want to converse in conversations, round conversations with students. So really practicing dialogues, amplifying conversational vocabulary, providing more fluency. We have forgotten about oral language and dual language. Why? Because we're always looking about academics and about literacy, but we forget about oral language, which is what's going to glue together our students and our social interactions and our engagement with students. We need to also reflect on the types of activities that we're using. Most of the things I saw were very superficial. The dancing, the heroes, the biographies, the after-school little programs. Very little talking about social justice and equity issues. We need to really examine teacher support systems, considerations for language policy. We need to keep true to program design. Sorry, Esther. But more time on task on English does not equal more rapid acquisition of English. And Esther alluded to that we can't do that. We can't be tweaking the programs to keep adding more English. Then don't call yourselves dual language anymore. This cross-cultural proficiency, we need to really adopt culturally responsive teaching strategies for social justice and equity. Go beyond the heroes and the holidays. The language status closely examines the glossia. We need to take a look at how the two languages really function. We don't have enough data there. And to look at really what the investments are for all our students in L1 or 2, and for our ELs to stop reverting to English at the expense of their primary language. A call for action, definitely, for state-adopted materials that need to really meet the needs of our programs and be more congruent with goals. For further research, I am advocating maybe these are two areas to look at. Why do students in two-way immersion still struggle for equitable spaces? After so many years of doing these programs, we still need research in upper grade to and middle school pertaining to this area to find out what the challenges are linguistically and what are the cultural capital that we see in our classrooms. The other one is about strategies that teachers can use to create language status balance in our programs, in our settings. More research is needed on how students view themselves linguistically and cultural in terms of capital in our programs. And really taking a look at how are we implementing that third goal through teacher voices as well as student voices. What is the field telling us? Recommended resources, Cultivating Communities of Practice, A Guide to Managing Knowledge. This is a wonderful book to talk about building communities in your schools. And the other one, it's one that I would highly recommend, is Cultural Proficient Practice, Supporting Educators Who Deal with English Language Learners. And thank you very much. I'm probably way out of time by now, but thank you so much.
I just want to rectify, I never said.
Well, good morning. I want to thank Esther for the kind invitation to come today and present a portion of the dissertation that I completed last December. So I am at that point in my career where I identify still with the university where I did my dissertation and also with the university that I work at. And I should say, too, that I come to this research from a completely different background. My background as in two-way immersion is as a two-way immersion parent and the spouse of a world language Spanish teacher. And also as someone who teaches heritage language speakers in college composition classes. So I come to this very differently and feel that I represent a call that Guadalupe Valdez has made for people to cross disciplinary boundaries to look at language instruction in a variety of different settings. So I've taken that call that she's made very seriously. So I'm going to try to capture as much of the complexity involved in the multi-site study that I engaged in the time allowed, but hope that those of you interested in the themes of the trajectory of language learning and use of two-way immersion students over the course of their years in school and in language policy formation and in language domains and content areas will ask questions, and feel free to contact me here at the conference or later by mail. So the beginning point for the study really came when I first began my doctoral studies and read for the first time Guadalupe Valdez's cautionary note. So what I will present today focuses on language ideologies in two-way immersion and world language immersion, or world language programs. So that larger context for that focus resides in the field of language policy studies. Language ideologies inform both de jure and de facto language policy, and both are in operation in all language education programs, including two-way immersion programs. My study eventually considered the formation of both de jure policy, that is consciously, overtly formed policy, and de facto policy, that is the policy that gets made on the ground. But first, I became interested in understanding the formation of de facto language policy in two-way immersion programs, and that proceeded from my exposure to Valdez's cautionary note in the 1997 Harvard Educational Review about the formation of de facto language policy in two-way immersion programs. Her thoughts about the impact of parent, teacher, student, and administrator involvement in policy formation on Mexican-American students, Mexican heritage students, challenged my previously untroubled views of two-way immersion education. And led me to the question of how and where we would see the development of de facto language policy in a two-way immersion program. She talks about the role that de facto language policy plays in the lives of two-way immersion students, but doesn't identify where that happens or how that happens. So I became interested in doing that. So this is not my research question, but the developing question that I had in the very beginning of my studies was how and where would we see the development of de facto language policy in a two-way immersion program? So in order to understand that, I found myself drawn to two different fields of study. And that question led me first to the field of language policy studies, in which scholars have been moving toward more refined definitions of de facto language policy, how it's formed, where we might see its formation. So Spolsky, first of all, expanded our view of language policy formation to include language practices, language ideologies, and language management. And others have come along since then, including Shohami, to further define that. Shohami says that the real language policy of a political and social entity should be observed through devices that are used to perpetuate language practices, often in covert and implicit ways. These are what she calls language mechanisms. And those language mechanisms reside somewhere between language ideologies and language practices. So you can see the field trying to map out where do these things occur. Both the activity of language policy formation and the language practices of different language education programs suggested to me a whole other area of theory, a different theoretical lens for my study, and that is cultural historical activity theory, or what we call CHAT, and the work of Erika Engström and the Center for Activity Theory and Work Research. So CHAT provided me several analytical tools for my study. It invited a way of thinking about language policy mechanisms as tools for accomplishing language policy aims. So the other night, you had the opportunity to hear a little bit about first generation cultural historical activity theory through Merrill Swain. And so my study actually was based primarily on second and third generation cultural historical activity theory. So I'll say a little bit about that. So in Thursday evening's plenary session, Merrill Swain elaborated on Vygotsky's original activity triangle, which you can see up at the top of this triangle. The points of the triangle are called different things in different contexts. So in this case, when we talk about the subject, we're talking about an individual, a person who is engaged in an activity in order to accomplish an object. And instruments is also referred to as tools. And so that tools, of course, as Swain pointed out the other night, include language. And all of those instruments or tools mediate that activity. This illustrates second generation CHAT, which added in the important components of community, rules, and division of labor that are always involved in activity and learning. So no learning takes place strictly by individuals. There are always communities. There are always rules that are generated by those communities as to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and who gets to do what in any learning situation. So second generation CHAT provided me a model for thinking about the relationship between the object of language learning and use in a language education program, the different subjects or individuals involved in that program, the various communities involved, teachers, students, parents, administrators, and the rules or language ideologies that they held and enacted, and gave me a dynamic model for looking at these things across multiple sites. So this is second generation CHAT. Third generation CHAT, Engström is theorizing a model in which multiple activity systems come together around a potentially shared object. And you can perhaps already inject into this the possibility that that potentially shared object actually is not a shared object, but that individuals in the different systems can have different ideas about what that object is. So it contributed a further way of thinking about those multiple activity systems of a multi-site, two-way immersion program. Many of our immersion programs cross sites, and many of our former two-way immersion students continue language learning across multiple school sites and multiple types of programs. So the sharing that they might have of the object between those systems is only potential. And so I was interested in understanding how differing beliefs or differing rules or ideologies about the object or the outcome by the subjects in each system, by individuals and by groups or communities, could create tensions between those sites. So let me say a little bit about the sites in which I did my study. So I worked in the Midville Spanish Immersion Program in the Midville School District, which is in Northern California. It is a multi-site program that consists of K-5 elementary, which at the time had 1.5 strands of two-way Spanish immersion. It was based on a 90-10 model. The middle school program, which at the time I was studying it had been in existence for approximately 5 years, 5 to 7 years. It consisted of a 6th grade core language arts and social studies, and the students transitioned in 7th and 8th grade into a world language model of education. But that program was in transition during the time that I was doing my study. So high school Spanish language classes were where the students went after middle school, and most former Spanish immersion students took Spanish through Spanish language AP. So as I was doing my study, I began to identify, when I was piloting actually at the middle school, began to see what Engstrom calls contradictions, that is, historically accumulating structural tensions within and between the activity systems. Middle school Spanish teachers were not happy with the language performance of former Spanish immersion students after they left 6th grade and felt they were not prepared for high school language classes. That this displeasure was felt by students, teachers, parents alike, and created conflict in classrooms. So I began to hypothesize that those conflicts were coming from those contradictions between the various activity systems. So I mapped out the activity systems and some of the communities involved. So you can see a little bit of that right here. Who were the subjects involved? Who were some of the communities? Elementary school Spanish immersion teachers, middle school Spanish immersion foreign language teachers, high school world language teachers. So the elements of the study I won't say much about. It was a qualitative study in which in each of the 3 settings I engaged in participant observation, and both in class and in culminating experiences. In the 5th grade class, that was a science and culture camp in Mexico. And in the high school, that meant observing the AP exam. I did interviews with stakeholders in each of the different areas, the different sites, focusing on language ideologies, beliefs about bilingualism, about language learning, about the goals of the program, and to try to tease out what differences I could see. So what I ended up with was a comparative study between the 5th grade Spanish immersion model and the Spanish language AP model, focusing on Ms. Gomez and Mr. Mann. Ms. Gomez was a 5th grade Spanish immersion teacher and had been teaching in Spanish immersion programs for over 10 years. She was also part of the Bay Area Writing Project and conducted professional development in both English and Spanish, so she was very much committed to the field and very much like the teachers that Anna was talking about in her presentation. Mr. Mann was the Spanish language AP teacher, who's also a veteran Spanish language teacher, department chair, involved outside school in weekend immersion Spanish camps, and conducted professional development for Spanish language AP, had also taught at the middle school level. So I want to highlight just a couple of things about their differences in language ideologies. Ms. Gomez consistently represented bilingualism as something that was connected to language use, and very specifically language use for good, for social justice purposes. And you could see this in her practices as well as in her talk about bilingualism. And I'll show you a quote from her in a moment. For her, biliteracy was the heart of bilingualism, that students could not have the full experience of being bilingual if they did not have biliteracy. She also emphasized the changing sense of social identity that students went through as they became more and more proficient in a second language, and emphasized the importance of growing cross-language awareness as well. So she was concerned with movement back and forth between the languages. But most importantly, I think, she was really concerned with students having authentic motives for learning versus what she saw in the world language culture as getting language into students. Interestingly enough, Mr. Mann shared some of the same ideologies or values as Ms. Gomez. He also saw bilingualism, or true bilingualism as he'd call it, as equated with biliteracy. His own personal experience had been one of pleasure and a sense of his own changing identity as he became more and more proficient in Spanish. However, he said that very clearly that two-way immersion students in Spanish language classes don't fit that well. And that was because primarily of gaps in language knowledge and use, very specifically their use of accents or lack of use of accents, and their misuse of the subjunctive. He cited those things several times. So, and these were messages that I heard from other world language teachers as well, at the middle school level and at the high school level. He also felt that while Ms. Gomez was really concerned with these authentic motives and using bilingualism for good, he was really concerned that two-way immersion students and parents were overly ambitious in their aims in learning language. So Ms. Gomez, this is a typical quote from Ms. Gomez. "I would hope they would use their bilingualism for good. Help somebody out who didn't. Help the señora out who was on the plane that couldn't read in Spanish to fill out her formulario, and so being able to help someone like that out because they can. Oh, wow, I can do this. Or help out a group, lead a group because the group is traveling and doesn't know Spanish, or to be the go-to person in a company. Can you work on this with me because I can't? I don't have that type of language facility. Yeah, sure. I learned that when I was in 5th grade. Hooray, good thing I did." So you can see this idea of social involvement and using it in their second language in a variety of settings. Mr. Mann's quote, "Well, I think sometimes the Spanish immersion students and perhaps their parents too were a little overly ambitious in thinking of what they could do as a general group, what they could do as 9th graders. And so I think the general assumption of parents in the past has been, well, they should start AP language. And we have worked hard, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, trying to help them understand that that's not the best place to start. You're coming with a lot of experience, but there are some things you're going to know, and there are some things you're not going to know. So the things you're going to know, you've got a free ride, basically. Feel good about that. But pay very close attention to the things you don't know." So I won't say a whole lot about this because I'm sure I need to move on fairly quickly, but it was also comparative study of classroom language practices. You can see me trying to get at this idea of language mechanisms somewhere between practices and ideologies in this. And so looking at these practices, so I'll just highlight a couple of things. Ms. Gomez's class was characterized by what I called guided autonomy and literacy activities. The students in her class, knew the routines and were able to follow them very clearly and on their own. They also read many, many books. In contrast, Mr. Mann's class was a teacher-centered classroom where language input, control, and rewards all went through him, and where very little lengthy reading took place. And you see this in the perceptions of former Spanish immersion students and the sense of discouragement that they had in high school, where there's absolutely no reading of books, there's just absolutely none. They all had a sense of losing ground and confidence in Spanish and had a desire for more autonomy in language use. They also complained about artificial and encapsulated forms of learning that depended upon textbooks or that expected them to produce language the way the teacher wanted it. Just very quickly, they all succeeded very highly in the AP exam. This was the first time that this data had been collected, and they all passed the AP exam with 4s and 5s. All right, I'm going to skip this part. So implications. We need more research to understand the various trajectories of language learning and use beyond two-way immersion in high school and in college. We need to understand those best practices and policies of programs that span school sites and articulate with world language programs, not just the bad examples, but the really good examples. We need to consider policy in classrooms and in programs, look at classroom activities and language domains as language policy mechanisms, that they have a role to play in forwarding de facto language policy, in understanding language ideologies of stakeholders in programs and the conflicts that come out of those ideologies. And then finally, in practice, considering what content areas are used to further language learning. And beyond content, to the activities themselves, how much student autonomy or teacher control are involved in these various models. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So what we're going to do now, because Rebecca is following us, as you notice, she's a active participant on the other side, all the way down. Oh, I'm sorry.
Here, this one.
But what she, since she couldn't be here in person, she has sent us her presentation that we'll be listening to and watching now, and then we'll open it up for discussions for everybody.
Hi, this is Rebecca Starr. I'm coming to you not so live today with this recorded presentation. Thanks so much for inviting me to share a bit of my research. I'm a sociolinguist, and my work on two-way immersion focuses on how elementary school-age children learn about sociolinguistic variation in two-way immersion classrooms. When we're thinking about what children need to learn in the process of language acquisition, it's important to keep in mind the notion of communicative competence. This is the idea that native speakers of a language know a lot more than just what is grammatical or not in their language. They also know what sort of speech is appropriate in different situations, what speech patterns are typical of different communities of speakers, and related information that helps them successfully navigate their speech community. In the case of a native speaker learning language in a conventional setting, speakers acquire this competence through the stylistic and social variation that they encounter every day. And by stylistic variation, I mean they encounter variation in how people use language in different situations. And social variation refers to different types of people, such as men versus women, speaking in different ways. One of the criticisms of language immersion has been that, although it certainly achieves results that are superior to conventional language learning, students will never be able to achieve competence comparable to native speakers because their exposure to variation is necessarily limited due to the classroom setting. This is a criticism that has been made in the case of conventional one-way immersion, where students are all getting second language exposure entirely from the teacher. Now, in the dual language or two-way immersion model, I'm pretty agnostic about that terminology, Each class is composed of both native speakers and learners. We might imagine that this results in language being used in a wider variety of ways, and certainly by a wider variety of people. It's still an open question what kind of sociolinguistic variation is present in this setting. The main question I've addressed in my research on two-way immersion is, what sociolinguistic knowledge can students in early primary school acquire in a dual language immersion setting? And I've examined three aspects of classroom language that may influence student language use: teacher language use, native speaker classmate language use, and metalinguistic discourse. Today, I just have time to briefly discuss the first 2 points, teachers and classmates. And to preview the major finding I'd like to share today, that students learning a new language in a dual language immersion setting do not simply imitate the speech of their teachers or the speech of their classmates, but rather they're able to exploit sociolinguistic patterns in the input they receive to target and acquire a distinct language variety. Before I introduce my results, we've been asked to talk about some influential work that has informed our own research. The first paper I want to mention is Rubinstein Avila's 2002 work on problematizing the dual in dual immersion. This is a project that ethnographically examines dialect-related conflicts that arise among Portuguese, Brazilian, and Cape Verdean members of a school community in a Portuguese-English dual language program in the United States. The second paper, which you guys might not be familiar with, is Smith et al.'s 2007 paper in Language Variation and Change. It has this amazing title that I will not attempt to pronounce, and it's about how Scottish children acquire the variation patterns of their caregivers. This is a really helpful paper for thinking about how children learn about how language is used in different contexts. And finally, I wanted to recommend Wong Fillmore's 1985 paper on teacher talk as input in second language acquisition. This paper explores how different classroom settings and teaching strategies affect student learning outcomes. So now it's time to introduce my own research. I spent a year doing fieldwork at the Jong School, which is a pseudonym for a private dual language immersion school in the United States. This is a Mandarin English program, which intends to teach standard Taiwan Guoyu Mandarin and American English. I conducted fieldwork with 2 classes of first graders and 1 class of second graders, with about 45 students total. So first we're going to look at what teachers are doing with language in this setting. As we've seen, an assumption made in the immersion literature is that teachers use teacher talk, and therefore students who spend their school day listening to a teacher are not going to be exposed to much variation. This fits in with a more general assumption in sociolinguistics that teachers are the users and promoters of standard, formal, prestigious language varieties of the community. What we see in the literature is a lot of assumptions about how teachers talk and virtually no actual research. So let's address these questions. Do teachers really speak the same way all the time in the classroom? And what about teachers who don't natively speak a standard language variety? Teachers who are native speakers of varieties that are not promoted in their school face several challenges in the classroom. First, they must construct and perform an educator persona when their native variety is not associated with education. Second, they may have to fend off challenges and corrections coming from students in relation to their language use. Finally, they need to find a way to educate students in a way that is acceptable to the school and not be accused of teaching them to speak incorrectly. We can also view this scenario from the student's perspective. Students whose primary exposure to a language is a teacher who doesn't speak a standard variety will face challenges. We might wonder, can students learn a language variety from a teacher who doesn't consistently use that variety? Will students even want to learn standard language, or will they be aware that their teacher doesn't speak it? And finally, will students just get hopelessly confused by being exposed to several different varieties of a language from different teachers and native-speaking students in their school? The main research question I've addressed in my study of teacher speech is, do teachers make use of predictable patterns of variation that might provide cues to students as to the social and stylistic meaning of certain variables? Today I'll focus on 3 Mandarin-speaking teachers at the Jong School. Taiwan teacher is the primary first grade teacher from Taiwan. MT teacher is the music teacher, also from Taiwan. They're both in their 40s. They've taught at the school for several years. NE teacher is from northeastern mainland China in her 30s, and this was her only year teaching as a primary teacher for the 2nd grade. She's also one of the only non-Taiwanese teachers in the program. And crucially, all 3 of these teachers use non-standard varieties typical of their respective native regions. The linguistic variable we're looking at today is a pronunciation difference in different dialects of Mandarin. In Standard Mandarin, there's a distinction between dental and retroflex sibilant initials, zi, si, si, and zhi, chi, shi. For example, si means for and shi means to be. In northern China, this distinction still exists, but different words are assigned to different initial consonants. For example, in this northern dialect, standard zu is pronounced zhu and shi is pronounced si. And in southern varieties, including the one used in Taiwan, the zhi, chi, and shi sounds are merged with zi, si, and si. Use of this non-standard merger is very widespread, but also quite stigmatized and considered to be a sign of poor education. In my analysis of Shanghai Mandarin, I found that the merger correlated with lower education levels, male speakers, older speakers, and with casual speech. This is a very typical pattern in sociolinguistics for a stigmatized non-standard feature. When we study the dental retroflex distinction in the classroom, we'll be asking these questions. Do teachers use standard dental and retroflex initials? If not, are there consistent patterns in their use? What do these patterns tell us about the social meaning of these variables? And finally, could students pick up on these patterns to acquire the standard dental retroflex distinction, or maybe to learn something about the social meaning of these variables? In this analysis, I'm going to look at how teachers use language in various speech situations that come up in the classroom. We can categorize the major types of utterances that teachers produce in class into 4 categories. There's reading or singing aloud, topical instructional speech, which means teaching, topical non-instructional speech, which refers to administrative discussion about assignments or activities, and behavior management, which we could divide into scolding, praising, or neutral behavior comments. But to be honest, it's mostly scolding. So today, I only have time to give a quick summary of these results. This is a graph of all 3 teachers' use of standard retroflex initials. So higher bars here mean more standard. We can see that all 3 teachers are following the same general pattern in that reading is extremely standard, almost at 100%, followed by instructional speech, and then down and down. And at the bottom, we get behavior management, where teachers use very non-standard pronunciation. The 2 teachers from Taiwan, which was Taiwan and MT teacher, show extremely similar rates of use in every utterance type, while NE teacher in the middle shows less variation, but the same overall pattern. We can model this variation using a linear mixed effects statistical model in the statistics program R, where we find that controlling for speaker and lexical item, there are significant effects of utterance type, as we saw, as well as several effects of phonological context that make the use of standard retroflex more likely. I stuck this in here for those of you who are interested in Chinese linguistics. The key finding here is that we see a consistent difference between utterance type, and in particular, an interesting difference between instructional and non-instructional speech, meaning that when the teachers are talking to the class about curricular topics, they're significantly more standard. Now, why is this happening? We can view instruction as a speech situation that requires the performance of a teacher persona, and also as a situation that highlights language, which would lead teachers to use more standard pronunciation. And we could also postulate that instruction may be more planned or rehearsed, leading to more standard pronunciation. The general conclusions of my language use analysis are that teachers vary considerably but predictably in different teaching contexts. And even though these teachers come from different regions, they're nonetheless giving consistent signals about the social meaning of the dental retroflex distinction. And finally, teachers draw upon the social meaning of standard retroflex to perform an instructor persona, while they use non-standard dental initials to perform scolding, more of a disciplinarian persona. Now, what does this mean for the students? Could students acquire standard pronunciation from these teachers? Although teachers frequently use non-standard pronunciation, if the students know where to look, namely in reading and instructional contexts, they can find reliable examples of standard pronunciation. Secondly, could students acquire knowledge of the social meaning of the dental retroflex distinction based on evidence from these teachers? Definitely yes. The second analysis I'd like to present today looks at student language use. One of the challenges of doing a study like this is the very diverse population of students in a dual language program. In this program, each class is divided about equally between Mandarin background and non-Mandarin background students, and students are spending half the day learning in each language. Now that we know what the teachers are doing, we want to check whether students are acquiring the same variety used by their teacher. And a second question, what is the impact of having native speaker classmates on student learners? Now in this presentation, I'm going to focus only on the two classes of first graders, looking only at data from the end of the year to maximize the impact that classmates and teachers have had on students. This is using all the data from individual student speech in that time period. Something interesting we can take advantage of in this analysis is that there happens to be a big difference in the overall speech patterns of the native speaker students in Class 1 versus Class 2. In Class 1, on the left, we can see that almost all of the native speaker students have very standard pronunciation in all three speech contexts that I analyzed. Whereas in contrast, for Class 2 on the right, we see that no students at all are using totally standard pronunciation, and several of the students are very, very non-standard, using almost no retroflex initials whatsoever in their speech. So, as we've just seen, we have a big distinction between Class 1 and Class 2 in terms of native speaker classmate language use. What impact will this have on the non-native learner students in each class? Here's the language use data for Class 1. On the left, we have the native speakers that we saw in the previous graph. On the right, we have the learners. What strikes us immediately here is that the non-native students are almost 100% standard in their pronunciation in all speech contexts. And now let's look at Class 2. Once again, we have native speakers on the left, non-native learners on the right. You'll notice here on the right I have some missing bars. That's not because their pronunciation is non-standard, just because there wasn't enough data for these particular speech contexts. But overall, the picture here is that learners are much more standard than their native speaker classmates, but at the same time, they are significantly less standard than the learners were back in Class 1. And here's a reminder of how the students are performing in comparison with their primary teacher, who was Taiwan teacher. She's the teacher of both Class 1 and Class 2. Focusing on the non-native students in each class, we can see that they are overall significantly more standard than the teacher and in their native speaker classmates. And they also don't seem to be more or less standard in the three speech contexts that I analyzed, which are, by the way, read speech, curricular speech, and non-curricular speech. So the key findings here are every single non-native learner in these classes is acquiring a more standard variety than their teacher uses. Also, there's an effective classmate language use in that the learner students in Class 2 are less standard than the learner students in Class 1. And I don't have time to talk about this today, but there is more extensive data looking at hypercorrection that strengthens the findings I've presented here. What can we conclude about classmate language effect? We did find significant differences between the learners in the two classes, but at the same time we found that learner students were significantly more standard than their native speaker peers. This suggests there's a significant but limited effect of classmate language use. My analysis of student language use has yielded a few conclusions. While the native speaker students appear to be happy to stick to their own home variety in the classroom, learner students are acquiring significantly more standard pronunciations. Also, learner success at acquiring the standard dental retroflex distinction is mediated by the availability of reliable sources of input from classmates and their own sociolinguistic abilities. The overall conclusions of this project include the finding that all members of the Mejong community engage in linguistic and metalinguistic practices which reflect local social meanings. Teachers in the school make use of linguistic resources to construct various personae appropriate to different teaching contexts. And students exploit patterns in teacher and classmate speech in order to target and acquire a variety of Mandarin distinct from their input. Briefly, for future work, I'd like to encourage more rigorous analysis of teacher speech, and also more quantitative work on how language variation is used and transmitted in two-way immersion programs. And finally, some implications for policy and practice. I hope this work makes it clear that teachers who speak a non-standard native variety are nonetheless able to effectively transmit standard language in the classroom. Moreover, I would argue that exposure to non-standard varieties is actually beneficial to students. It allows students to acquire competence with a wider range of language varieties. And finally, the dialect makeup of native speakers in the classroom is relevant to learner outcomes. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Okay, you're back. You can unmute your microphone now, I guess.
Hi, everybody.
I hope you could see how each one of these different studies kind of met a gap in the two-way immersion literature by looking at different languages, different topics. And I think they raise a lot of interesting questions that I will ask if the audience doesn't have any questions. It's interesting to realize how much we do know on the one hand, but once we start really kind of digging into classroom practice, how much there still is to learn. So we have plenty of time for discussion. So I will give you an opportunity, obviously, first to ask questions of the different panel members, and Rebecca is here, so you can ask everybody here whatever it is that you're curious about. Don't be shy. Come on. Did it make you think? Did it make you wonder about your own practices? Who speaks non-standard varieties in their classrooms? Right? No questions? There you go. Come on. Sharon, can you make sure to repeat the question so we all know what?
Sure. I hear you saying that you're focusing on your concerns for teacher preparation, in particular for world language or foreign language teachers in their encounters with two-way immersion students when they come into their classrooms, preparation for differentiation of instruction. Yes. Yes. Right. Right. As far as I know, in the program that I was working in, there really was very little thinking going on the part of world language instructors. And there weren't any that I knew of who had actually received any training whatsoever in understanding two-way immersion education. They had, at the district level, had made visits to two-way immersion classrooms, and one former teacher, or one French language teacher, had done a study to try to understand what was the language competency level of fourth graders in the two-way immersion program. But that had made no impact whatsoever. It had been filed away and forgotten by the teachers that I was working with. I totally agree that there's a need for that. Part of the study that I didn't get a chance to report on today was a middle school program review in which stakeholders from all of the different areas that two-way immersion students would end up coming into, either in the elementary school program or in the high school program, came together during a hiatus year for the middle school program and basically put together a program document that allowed the world language teachers to win out and represented the middle school program as a bridge to high school world language classes, and which meant that the middle school program would become nothing more than a mechanism for promoting this grammatical-based program. And the lack of resolution between these teachers from high school to elementary to immersion was so evident in the curriculum meetings that took place as they were preparing for this new middle school program that they thought they had developed, to the extent that teachers were still saying, look, we're really talking about two different things here. The immersion that you, the world language teacher, are talking about is not the same as the immersion that we're talking about. So there is a deep need, I think, in schools of education and training programs for foreign language, world language teachers to understand the differences in the models and to be willing to think about how can I differentiate my instruction for these students, for sure.
I just want to add to that. We had the same situation in Framingham, and one of the ways that we were able to counter it a little bit was the first 3 years of high school, they actually worked with an ESL teacher who taught Spanish language arts, as opposed to a world language teacher. So they were housed in the bilingual department and not in the world language department. This is turf issues, but it's one way that you keep the philosophy the same. Now, that wasn't true for AP Spanish, that the 12th grade AP Spanish was an AP Spanish class. And I actually interviewed that teacher, and she was very aware of the differences between the two students. And it was very much, I can see how the two-way students know how to use the language for real purposes. And I can see that we're focusing here on grammar, so she was able to distinguish it, but she had no clue what to do about it. And the kids were just like, they were used to reading, like you were saying, they're used to reading literature. And they're saying, we're analyzing one paragraph in a whole week.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, they were there because they kind of had to and they wanted to get the AP exam, but they did not feel at home at all, but it made a huge difference that they had Spanish language arts, bilingual teachers doing. So one thing is where do you house the program ends up being a very important
And I'd
part.
add to that, thinking in advance about the trajectory of these students when new programs are being established. So that thinking about, you know, when you're adding your second or third grade to a new program, what will be the trajectory, and starting to include those high school world language teachers in that process of thinking about that trajectory from the very beginning.
Good point. You had your hand up. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but
I just wondered if there were suggestions for how to do it, because we're right in the place where you say we're at fourth grade, and so ideas of sites that have done it well, or you've given me some ideas already, but
Yeah.
practices.
I'm not aware, and maybe Esther is more aware of sites that have done it well. I'm more aware of sites that haven't done it well. So, yeah.
So 1, 2, 3, but you have to speak in the microphone.
Yes, thank you to all. This is a question for Rebecca. If you are saying that the non-standard, that despite non-standard variations by teachers, children acquire it, I wonder if that holds true for non-native teachers. And this is specific to Mexico, where we have masses of teachers teaching English who are non-native. And so does that mean that the children can acquire? Is there any research that children can acquire? And I would assume the same thing holds true here with non-native Spanish teachers. Do children acquire then standard Spanish? Is it important, here? That's the first question. And then I have another question for everybody, and that includes the audience, is anybody doing any research in Mexico on literacy acquiring in bilingual schools? There are masses of them, and children are acquiring literacy in 2 languages as of kindergarten, both in English and Spanish, in many, many places, because unfortunately the public school system is not working very well in Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, etc. So I know it's an elitist education, but it's becoming less so. It's petered down to the middle classes also, and to the low middle classes with fees of maybe, $50, $100 a month, which is relatively accessible to a growing low middle class. So that's the second question for everybody about research of literacy acquirement.
Let's have Rebecca answer your first question first.
Okay,
You got that? You heard the question, right? You
Yeah,
did, okay.
yeah, I did. So you're asking about a scenario in which you have a school in Mexico with a native Mexican Spanish speaking teacher who is teaching ESL. Yes? Is that the scenario? Yeah. So I would say there that the situation, so the situation there is not entirely analogous because the non-standard features that teacher would have are coming from L1 transfer from Spanish, and the students in that class would be having the same issue, or they would have L1 transfer from Spanish. However, if you had a situation where, for example, the teacher had acquired British English, for example, and was teaching British English features, but using an American English textbook, and the students decided that they were going to target an American English norm, I think you might find something different. Yes. So I would say that when you're talking about L1 transfer issues, that students are going to acquire Spanish accented English regardless of the teacher. That's a kind of different situation, I would say.
I have to say, Rebecca's studies does remind me of that when you look at quote-unquote native English speakers in a two-way program, that they often acquire the academic Spanish, so to speak, the more formal Spanish, much more readily because that's what's being modeled and taught, but they have a much harder time with the informal, which creates then the issues around cooperative learning where they may not have the social language to actually keep the communication going, which is a slightly different dimension versus standard versus non-standard pronunciation, but it's kind of a similar formal, informal, and what is it that students are actually learning and using?
Yes, I would say that that's the same situation. And in general, what I found is that students are extremely sensitive, and in particular in two-way immersion programs where there's a lot of language code switching going on, students are extremely sensitive towards prescriptive norms. And they need only a little bit of information to pick up on what is a norm. And so for that reason, a lot of students will successfully target a variety that is not being used very often in the classroom because they perceive that to be the norm. So.
Yeah, good point. Sharon, we're going to respond to the Mexico research element.
I was just going to say that I understand I'm going to be invited to come and speak in Mexico about two-way immersion education in May, and so there's more interest in understanding or offering a variety of language experiences in schools. But I'll be learning about the context when I go, about the sociocultural context, in particular the economic contexts.
Can I add to that? I had the opportunity to work with border pedagogy in California, between Baja California, and work with teachers in Chula Vista, which is a district that's like 10 miles from the border of Mexico, and then teachers that were in Ensenada, in, I think it was Tecate, and also Tijuana. And so what we did is we formed a coalition at the university level on bringing these teachers together, the Southern California teachers who were in dual language programs with the teachers from Mexico. And the premise was to find out about each other's instructional practices and also to really connect teacher to teacher across border. We learned so much about what was going on in Mexico that was very similar to the same things that we were facing in the United States. These were public schools, the Secretaría. And the great thing about this project was that we brought teachers across the border. Our teachers from the United States went across the border to Mexico to visit the classrooms, to talk to the teachers, and to have conversations about pedagogy and materials and literacy and bilingualism. And then we did the same thing. We brought the teachers from Mexico over into the United States to observe our classrooms and have grand conversations. And what happened with that is the teachers developed a relationship with one another, to be able to email one another, be on Facebook with each other, and to also coordinate projects across the border. So they were sending each other cultural packages. The students were writing to each other in each other's native languages. It was basically done in Spanish with students that, but what we learned a lot is about the kind of students and the type of educational practices that they bring with them to the United States, because we always assume they come with nothing. With this deficit knowledge and this deficit thinking that we have to add our own to them because they really come with nothing. And what our teachers really realized is they came with such richness from their own families, from their own heritage, and there was a big difference between teacher behavior in classrooms. The United States was very formal, addressing the students, very little physical embracing or really supporting students in very nurturing ways. And when our teachers went to Mexico, they found teachers were like mothers. Kids were hugging them, kissing them. Ay, mijo, como te quiero. Ay, mi amorcito, ven acá. And it was just this entirely different relationship. And I think we learned more about the relationship from student-teacher than we did more about the pedagogy. And that's, I think, something that has really stuck with me forever. And I'll never forget the way the teacher and the student had a beautiful relationship that we are not able to replicate in the United States. And then these children, what was so sad is these children have this very nurturing relationship with their teachers across the border, come to the United States, and it's the opposite for them. They have no connection to the teacher, they have no connection to the curriculum, no connection to the language, and we wonder why in California our dropout rate is so high.
I had a question, I guess, for all of you about, you were talking earlier about the different language levels that students come with, being specifically this morning about Spanish and English. You were talking about their competencies in those. And I was wondering if there's research on students who are bicultural and bilingual and biliterate from the home. Have they been pulled out as a kind of as a study group in comparison to within those dual language immersion programs or not? I mean, I guess I'm concerned as a parent of those kinds of students and working in a dual language immersion program.
Are you talking about the RFEP students? Would those be the fluent English speaking students who have been redesignated? Or?
No, I'm talking about who have a native Spanish speaking parent and a native English speaking parent who are raised bilingually from birth, and their interaction within the dual language immersion programs. Have they been pulled out as a group? Is there a big enough group? I don't know. I'm just curious.
I don't think they've been pulled out as a group, and I think it's a really good question. In my experience, those kids are doing fabulous.
I mean, I'm thinking also too as their feeling about which language is dominant, which language is more important.
Well, I think one of the things that particular group raises, and it kind of again goes back to why do we force children to select L1 or L2? I think for those kids, particularly if you have a program, like the way that we used to do it in terms of native language literacy and then second language literacy, for those kids it was kind of like, well, you have both languages, and so both of them are L native language. And we ended up doing is talking to the parents actually and say, what would you prefer your child starts with? And then sometimes the parents would say, we prefer Spanish because we recognize that we can support English at home fine, but we were really very concerned about Spanish. Other parents would flip-flop it and do it the other way around. But that's a group that, so if you have a model that doesn't worry so much about L1 or L2, but basically says you're just acquiring literacy in this language, it's a lot easier than the kids actually don't have to make that kind of like, where am I in relationship to the two languages? So that piece kind of goes back again to the dichotomy. If we can just get rid of the dichotomy and just say, this is about all becoming bilingual, it helps a lot. But the L1, L2, Spanish, English dominant, kind of what you're struggling with too, the very artificial things that we do for administrative purposes sometimes, because we have to create a homeroom and you have to put kids somewhere. But how you communicate that, and actually what you say to the students, you know, you don't have to say, well, you're in my homeroom because, you know, you're a native Spanish speaker. You can do all kinds of things.
Yeah, can I add to that? So part of our work in this, I think a short answer to the question is really depends on the community context that in which your school is situated. And the community that the school that I work in is situated is, we did a survey of the parents and why they enrolled their kids in school and motives for coming in. And then we looked at different background demographic characteristics and tried to look at how, you know, their different lived experiences in the community mattered, instead of using this language dominance label to say these are the Latino parents and these are the Anglo parents. And what we found, and I think this is true across all the studies that I've read, is there's such heterogeneity, especially in the Latino parent group that choose to enroll their kids, especially in a whole school type situation, that I think is overlooked. And so I think questions of why they choose their, you know, which language they choose for their child really is related to things that have very little to do with their linguistic competency at the end of the day. And so I think it's an area really rich for looking at that cultural identity piece. I think it's a point of departure, actually, is looking at the parent community and why they choose these things for their children. Anyway, that's been my experience.
I have two things. One to comment on this is, and in Minnesota, one of the worst things that we have to do is decide which ethnic group our children belong to. And it's, did you want us to negate the father or the mother here? Because that's really what it comes down to. You choose one and then you're negating the other. And I think somehow the State Department needs to fix that piece of registration and labeling of children, because whether it's Latino and Anglo, there's also the millions of mixes between Afro-American, non-Afro-American, African, et cetera, that we seem to want to always put people in boxes, and it's very negative effect on where they get placed in terms of schools and advisories, and then how people are treating them as students. But you were asking about, your question about high school models. I think, I'm from St. Paul, and our Highland Park model, I think, is working really quite well. We're not perfect, but in our middle school, we now have 7th and 8th graders who are taking science, math, social studies in Spanish, as well as a Spanish immersion language arts and English. And then when they move into this high school, we have 2 immersion classes, one for 9th and 10th graders, but actually our numbers have now grown, so we have a 9th grade immersion class, language arts, a 10th grade immersion language arts that's reading, vocabulary, and grammar based as well. But then they move into an 11th and 12th grade immersion class that is more preparing them for IB test. And I don't know where it fits in, but because we are an MYP IB school or complex, I've heard that the IB test is more language rich, vocabulary rich, understanding, comprehension, skill based, as opposed to the AP type of testing, which is far more grammar and structure and that kind of a thing. So if it is something that you can have a voice in, it might be a direction that you would want to consider in terms of where to send or how to create the program in the future for the students that are in those kinds of roles. There's also such great stuff in the International Baccalaureate program that encourages service learning projects and that kind of thing that gets the students out into the community and provides opportunities for them to actually use their Spanish beyond the structure of the classroom.
Thank you for sharing that. Have any other questions? Erika, I have one question for your study. I don't think you have to apologize for numbers, by the way. It's all good. One of the things that they talk about with bilingual children is that the transfer and in linguistic interdependence is not just an L1 to L2, but also L2 to L1.
Right.
And so I was wondering, in your study, how do you deal with the bidirectionality of the relationships that might be going on, as opposed to just having a one-way direction?
That's a really good point. And I think that a lot of the difficulty theoretically that you run into is this assumption, right, that kids come with one language and then we're adding another language to it. And that has definitely been problematized in our work, because as you saw, the Spanish dominant kids were not Spanish dominant, they were bilingual, right? They had way more bilingual competencies. So that's one reason I'm interested in looking more carefully at how oral language impacts the literacy development in both languages, and really using a different method. That's one reason I was interested in disrupting this idea of there being a linear relationship at all between like a threshold, and trying to model it differently, because I think the relationships are way more complicated than they've been theorized, right? And I mean, that's been supported in the research like you mentioned. I think the way that it showed up in my students specifically would be in the sound awareness construct that kept coming up, acting completely different than all the other ones. Yeah. So if we remember, these kids are kindergartners and first graders, so emergent and early literacy. And so the Spanish dominant kids I think they had ceilinged out on the phonemic awareness task in English already, so there wasn't going to be any transfer. But then we saw that the threshold, and I didn't show you these numbers, but the threshold in their own language, well, the threshold effect was actually opposite. Like, there was this very counterintuitive finding when we were looking at the threshold effect that I think is because they have a lot more metalinguistic awareness, their phonological skills have ceilinged out. So I think if you look for it, as we start looking for it more carefully, we'll find ways that, and I really am moving towards this idea, I keep thinking about, and I keep talking to Liz about how to measure bilingualism, right? Just going towards this construct of just language in both language, in all your languages, and how do you give credit to kids for that, and how do you measure that, and how do you model it in a way that, reflects at all the complexity that exists. But I think that's a really important point. Thanks.
So notice that once we put a bilingual perspective onto our research and data, you start finding things that you would not or necessarily see if you
Absolutely.
just take an L2 perspective. And a lot of the literature on two-way immersion very much as an L2 perspective. When Liz and I reviewed the literature for our equalizing status and integrated settings article, we realized that the argument for native speaker, non-native speaker interactions is an L2 argument, right? You interact with a native speaker so you can practice your second language. Well, in a two-way context, when you put two bilinguals together who speak the same two languages, what's going to happen? They pick whichever one fits the communicative situation, right? So they don't need two languages to communicate. So the interaction piece, and you were pointing this out too, the interaction between native and speakers and non-native speakers, quote unquote, in a dual language program or a two-way immersion program has to be scaffolded in a very different way so that the natural choice, which is, well, we're all speaking two languages, let's pick the one that seems to be easiest right now, does not become necessarily the default place. But we're creating bilingual settings, so that's what's going to happen. So it's an interesting part. One thing I would just want to say about the culture thing comes up, have you noticed? In terms of what it means and social justice, and I'm really glad that Anna brought that up as a challenging area. As I was listening to you, though, what also seems to me is that we really see that as a separate thing to do. And I was wondering that the teachers scored themselves high on student-centered teaching. And it occurred to me, how can you rate yourself high on student-centered teaching if you're not thinking about cultural issues? Isn't that kind of part of that culture domain? So we need to have a lot more conversations about, so like I was thinking about your example of teachers going to Mexico and learning the different interactions. Well, if they're implementing that as part of their interactions now with students, that's doing the third goal. But it seems we're thinking of this as this is something extra in addition that we need to do. We need to talk about events and holidays and maybe service and deep culture kinds of things. But doesn't it have to be already embedded into what we're doing from the get-go? Because culture and identity, the minute a child comes into our classrooms, that's where it starts.
Esther?
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to follow up. So did I totally cut you off? I hope I didn't.
No.
Okay. Because I actually wanted to ask a similar question to Rebecca about
Yeah.
her work. That kept coming up for me throughout your presentation, was the idea that the variation in language is connected to the persona that the teacher takes, the sort of social stance or cultural stance that the student or that the teacher takes, how that is directly connected to the type of language the type of talk that they engage in. And I'm wondering if you saw that kind of the lens that Esther is talking about, the sort of cultural lens through that talk in any of your work.
Yes. I think that the fact that the school is Taiwanese dominant, but there's also some non-Taiwanese teachers and staff in the school, and there are also some non-Taiwanese students. But it creates a very interesting situation where you have sort of a dominant Taiwanese cultural influence in the school, but at the same time they realize that that's a minority culture in terms of Chinese at large. So you do have a very interesting situation where, to some extent, students are being integrated and learning about essentially a Taiwanese school context in which they learn how Taiwanese teachers teach. But at the same time, there's a sense that students should be learning more about China. And so I think that creates a very interesting situation. And in terms of how the teachers are teaching, they're teaching with Taiwanese materials and they're scolding. For example, the fact that they use a very heavy Taiwanese accent when they scold definitely gives children a sense of Taiwanese culture. and so students begin to associate more emotional language expressions with Taiwanese accents, essentially. And so I think it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the scaffolding that a number of you have talked about, especially Anna. If you could talk a little bit more about that, because on the one hand, it sounds like teaching that social language so that students can interact during peer interaction. On the other hand, that you talked about the silencing of students. If you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, that was something that was a revelatory issue for teachers. Some of them were not aware these things were happening in their classrooms because they were so busy engaged with students during small peer interactions or usually scaffolding and other students learning. But one of the conversations I had with them in their focus group was, how do you mitigate this? What are ways, what are some ideas that you have for these conversations that students are having where they're in Spanish language time, but reverting to English to accommodate the students that don't have the level of Spanish to maintain the conversation. And so some of the things that they brainstormed with me was for the scaffolding ideas were, well, perhaps we can do more since the beginning of the year, finally, they said, since the beginning of the year, tackle this as a language objective, where maybe we could do charts around the room for when they get stuck in conversations, things that they can do as to use for resources, rather than just saying, oh, what's the word for this, or I don't know how to say that, and just switching to English automatically. But can they refer to their notes? Can they have the textbook there? Can they refer? We talk a lot about print-rich environment, but are the students really using their environments to give them clues about the language that they need to use? And then they also talked about that the way the pedagogy was moving due to testing, they really weren't paying much attention to oral language development. It was more academic-based, academic language. It was more about reading and writing, so that the students were able to complete those tasks without much verbalizing the language, particularly Spanish. And so they needed to do a lot more scaffolding for Spanish in terms of providing the students metacognitive skills and resources within one another, that they needed to kind of figure this out, the students. Come up with a list of things to do if I get stuck in the language. What do I need to do instead of reverting to English? What can I do? Can I ask a student to prompt me? Would there be ways that we can go around the communication with maybe using some synonyms, using other varieties of sentences? And so it really boiled down to oral language development, that they really weren't doing enough at the beginning to continue it through the grade levels. And particularly once they hit 4th grade, which is where the teachers started to see it, where things were more cognitive demanding in terms of reading and writing, they had kind of dropped off on the oral language part. So there was no more for listening comprehension or oral development. And so those were ways that they were trying to figure out how to scaffold more or get back to more oral language opportunities for them in Spanish.
I'd add to that, too, that in my study, one of the things I saw was growing teacher awareness of specific social and academic domains or language domains in which students had big holes in their conversational ability, their oral language abilities, including Ms. Gomez. When we were at the camp in Mexico, her students were playing soccer, and all of her kids were playing soccer in English, and the kids from the Mexican school that were there were playing soccer in Spanish, and she could see the tensions building between the two teams over that. And I asked, do you think your kids have ever played soccer in Spanish before? And she said, I don't know. Maybe they haven't. So she pulled them aside and said, what do you need to be able to say in Spanish? And gave them a few phrases and began to see a difference immediately that they finally had the language of that domain. So thinking in terms of domain as well as in terms of just general oral competencies can be really helpful as well.
It's one area where you can really privilege your Spanish speakers in a two-way immersion program, because the minute you ask, what are different ways to say this, your Spanish speakers are way ahead of everybody else. And so to actually generate a list of different things to say in different situations, your native Spanish speakers can be great help to simply ask them, so we're going to play this game, what are some things that you might need to actually play the math game? And your native Spanish to come up with very sophisticated ways of interaction, and it's kind of a cool thing to do. So thinking about elevating the status. We did some research on think per share in a 1st grade classroom, and looking at what do teachers do. They were aware of the need for oral language. This is 1st grade, so they use this particular structure, and you think per share. But the amount of scaffolding that they did, both in terms of content, so that was the first step of scaffolding. There was all front work that they had to do. So they did content scaffolding, making sure that all the kids were kind of on the same page and knew the background that they were going to have to use. And then vocabulary, and then linguistic scaffolding. So the teachers did model what they wanted the students to use as they were doing a think per share. And all of those steps were necessary so that by the time the teacher said, okay, now talk to your partner, da-da-da-da-dum, the kids were actually ready to do so and stay in Spanish as much as they could. You're going to say something?
I was going to add to that conversation that we always tend to think about what else can we do in terms of the conversation, but also we need to teach the students strategies, particularly the ELs, how to turn that conversation at that table around. So that if it starts going into English, what can they do to get it back to Spanish? And so those are things that as teachers I kept thinking, those are strategies that we need to develop. And give the kids these kinds of tools so that when they're in those situations, they can take control and get that conversation back in that language.
Well, thank you all for coming and staying and participating. I hope you had a good time. And thank you, panelists, each and every single one of you here and from farther away. And enjoy the rest of the conference.